I used to think weeds were just something I hadn't figured out how to kill properly. But every spring, right after I cleared a garden bed, those tiny green shoots would start popping up again between my vegetable rows. The hard part was never getting rid of weeds once. The hard part was that they always came back, in the pathways, under fences, around plant bases, and even in beds I was sure were already clean. For a long time I treated weeds like a war. Weeds showed up, I tried to kill them, and when they came back, I looked for a stronger way to fight them. But when I started looking into self-sufficient communities like the Amish, I noticed something strange. They didn't talk about weed killing the way I expected. I thought I would find a secret recipe, a homemade spray, or some old trick passed down through generations. But what I kept finding instead were conversations about soil, mulch, cover crops, manure, and small things done consistently over time. That confused me. If weeds are such a big problem, why does so much of the conversation not even start with weeds, but with soil? The more I looked into it, the more I started to think I was asking the wrong question. Maybe the real issue wasn't how to kill weeds faster, but what was giving them the chance to show up in the first place? That question changed the way I see my garden, not just as a place where I fight weeds, but as a system where some areas naturally give weeds fewer chances to take hold. Cover crops. Don't leave the soil empty. I used to think an empty garden bed meant the job was done. The vegetables were harvested, the weeds were cleared, and now the soil could rest for a while. But in the real garden, things don't really stay that way. Just a few weeks after leaving it bare, new weed seedlings start popping up across the soil surface. I kept seeing this happen season after season. The longer I left the soil exposed, the more time I had to spend dealing with weeds later on. That made me start asking a different question. Was weeds really the main problem? Or did the problem start the moment I left the soil uncovered? When I looked into self-sufficient communities like the Amish and other traditional farming systems, I noticed they almost never leave soil bare for long between growing seasons. Instead of leaving a bed empty for weeks, they try to put another plant into that space as quickly as possible. I started applying the same idea in my own garden. After harvesting a bed, I try to plant a cover crop within days or weeks, instead of leaving the soil exposed. Common choices are clover, winter rye, or vetch. The goal isn't to harvest them, but simply to keep the soil covered before weeds take over. Depending on the crop and weather, many cover crops can establish a visible cover within about 3 to 6 weeks. Winter rye is especially popular because it grows quickly and handles cold conditions well. Clover is also widely used because it not only covers the soil, but over time it helps improve soil fertility as well. What I realized is that this isn't really a war against weeds. It's a competition for who gets to occupy the empty space on the soil surface. And if covering the soil already creates such a big difference, what happens when we control the amount of sunlight that actually reaches the soil surface? Thick mulch. Cover the soil before weeds cover it. After realizing that bare soil is almost always taken over by something, I started paying attention to another question. What happens when the soil surface stops receiving much sunlight? Because whether it's vegetables or weeds, seeds only sprout when the conditions are right. And for many common garden weeds, light is a key part of that signal. I started noticing the difference between 2 areas in the garden. One was bare soil after weeding. The other was covered with leaves, straw, or wood chips. After a few weeks, the bare soil would usually start showing new weed seedlings. Meanwhile, the covered area stayed noticeably quieter. At first, I thought mulch was only for keeping soil moisture. But the more I used it, the more I realized it was doing something just as important. It was reducing the amount of light reaching the soil surface. And with less light reaching the ground, more weed seeds struggle to even start their life cycle. A mulch layer that is too thin is often quickly penetrated by sunlight. That's why many gardeners prefer a layer around 2 to 4 inches thick instead of just a light dusting on top. During hot summer days, soil under mulch usually holds moisture much longer than bare soil. Just digging a few inches down is often enough to clearly feel the difference. What's interesting is that this layer doesn't just affect weeds. It also reduces temperature swings in the topsoil and creates a more stable environment for the soil itself. I started seeing a repeating pattern. The healthiest parts of the garden were rarely the ones exposed all the time. They were usually the ones where the soil surface was rarely left bare. That made me think about a bigger difference. Bare soil and covered soil can sit right next to each other, but the opportunities they give to weeds are completely different. And the more I observed, the more I realized something else. It's not just light that gives weeds an advantage. Timing matters just as much. Because a newly sprouted weed and a fully established weed are actually two completely different battles. Why they don't start with herbicides. Herbicides only deal with what has already appeared above the soil. But in a garden, the real problem usually starts long before that. Weeds show up because there is open space, sunlight, bare soil, or seeds waiting for the right conditions. When I looked into self-sufficient communities like the Amish, I realized their way of thinking is much more practical. Don't just ask how to kill weeds, ask why weeds have the opportunity to grow here in the first place. One approach reacts after weeds have already appeared. The other tries to reduce the conditions that allow weeds to appear at all. Don't wait for weeds to go to seed. There's something I realized a bit too late. A tiny weed seedling in a vegetable bed and a weed that's already ankle-high, with strong roots and getting ready to flower, are no longer the same problem. In the past, I used to wait until I could actually see weeds everywhere before dealing with them. It looked like I was saving time, but in reality, I ended up bending down longer, pulling harder, and removing much more. I started noticing that small weeds usually take only a few seconds to remove, but once they grow bigger, with stronger roots or signs of going to seed, they turn into a completely different kind of job. That's when I understood why experienced gardeners always try to deal with weeds while they're still small. The value isn't in the tools they use, it's in stepping in before the problem gets worse. When weeds are young, a shallow hoe or a quick pull by hand is often enough. A short weekly check is usually far easier than waiting a whole month and turning weed control into a major cleanup job. What surprised me is how little time many weed species need to go from a seedling stage to producing seeds. Under the right conditions, some can start producing seeds in just a few weeks. That's when a small weed turns into a problem for the next season, because a single mature weed can produce hundreds, sometimes even thousands of seeds depending on the species. That means next year's workload is often decided by what happens this year. I started seeing early weeding not as a battle, but as a way to prevent the battle from happening in the first place. This was also the first time I truly realized that many weeds in the garden don't just appear out of nowhere. They come from seeds that were already sitting in the soil long before. And the more I learned, the more I saw an even bigger opponent than the weeds you see on the surface. The weed seeds lying dormant in the soil, waiting for their chance. Weed seeds never really disappear. After trying to understand why so many people focus on removing weeds before they go to seed, I started running into another question. If I've been weeding for years, why do they still keep coming back? At first, I thought new weeds must be coming from wind, birds, or surrounding land. That's partly true, but the more I learned, the more I realized a lot of weed seeds were already sitting in the soil from before. That's when I first heard the term seed bank, a natural reservoir of seeds existing right under our feet. Some of these seeds can stay dormant in the soil for years before the right conditions trigger them to sprout. I started to understand why some garden beds look weed-free for a long time, but as soon as you disturb the soil or leave it bare for a while, new weeds suddenly appear. Chances are they were already waiting there. Once I understood this, I also started seeing soil management in long-term farming systems differently. Every time soil is heavily disturbed, some of those dormant seeds can be brought closer to the surface, where they finally get the chance to grow. That's when I began to look at weeds in a different way. The weeds I see above ground are only the visible part of the problem. Most of the story is happening somewhere I can't even see. Don't let one weed turn into 1,000. After understanding the seed bank, I started looking at a single weed in a very different way. If this plant manages to go to seed, it's no longer just one weed anymore. In the past, I often delayed weeding. I thought leaving it for another week wouldn't make much of a difference. But in reality, sometimes it makes a huge difference. Some weed species can produce hundreds, even thousands of seeds from a single mature plant. That's why missing just one weed can matter more than most people think. That's when I realized the seed bank doesn't just come from the past. We might actually be adding to it every single growing season. I started paying attention to weeds that were getting ready to flower or set seed. Not because they're harder to remove, but because that's the point where a single plant can start creating problems for many seasons ahead. A weed pulled before it sets seed, and a weed left until the end of the season can lead to two completely different gardens the following year. What's interesting is that this approach isn't about trying to eliminate weeds completely. It's about reducing the number of new seeds entering the system each year, before small problems accumulate into much larger ones. When soil is soft, problems are easier to handle. After struggling many times with weeds deeply rooted in dry soil, I started to understand why timing matters so much. The same weed pulled in soft soil and in dry soil feels like two completely different experiences. After a good rain, the soil usually becomes looser and softer. The small roots are no longer locked in as tightly as they are during long dry spells. I realized that many young weeds can be pulled out much more easily at this point, sometimes bringing out far more of the root compared to when I try to remove them from hard, dry soil. This is something you can clearly test in any garden. Just try pulling the same type of weed in dry soil, and then after a rainstorm, the difference is usually obvious in your hands. A less stressful garden doesn't always come from doing more work. It often comes from doing the right work at the right time, when problems are still small and the soil is soft enough to respond easily. And when I started looking at weeds this way, I also began to notice something bigger. What grows above the soil is often telling us a lot about what's happening below it. After all of this, I realized I had spent too much time looking at weeds and not enough time looking at the soil. Because the longer I garden, the more I see that weeds are not always the root problem. Sometimes they're just a signal that something else is happening underneath. I started noticing that areas with thick organic matter, regular compost additions, and less bare soil tend to have very different weed pressure compared to poor or heavily disturbed soil. That doesn't mean healthy soil has no weeds, but stronger plants, denser canopy cover, and a protected soil surface usually leave weeds with far fewer opportunities to take over. When I looked into self-sufficient communities like the Amish and other long-term farming systems, I noticed most of their work isn't focused on killing weeds. It's focused on feeding the soil. Compost, aged manure, crop rotation, and organic mulch all look different on the surface, but they all point toward the same goal: building healthier soil over time. And that's when I realized something. Maybe weeds aren't the main lesson of the garden. The biggest lesson is that everything eventually comes back to the soil. I started this journey looking for a better way to control weeds, but in the end, what I found wasn't a formula or a special trick at all. I learned that many weed problems actually begin long before the first weed even shows up. They start with bare soil, with seeds waiting in the background, and with small tasks that were delayed for too long. I also realized that the goal was never to completely eliminate weeds from the garden. That's probably something that will never happen anyway. Seeds will still arrive with the wind. New seedlings will still appear. And nature will always try to fill any empty space we leave behind. There's a huge difference between constantly reacting to problems and building a system where problems have fewer chances to appear in the first place. Maybe that's what impressed me most when I looked at long-standing gardening and farming systems. They don't rely on a single solution. They rely on many small habits repeated consistently over a long time. And maybe that's the lesson I carry with me after this video. Not how to defeat weeds once and for all, but how to give my garden fewer opportunities for weeds each year than the year before.